Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, wherever you're located. I understand I'm talking to a really international audience today, so I'm really excited that all of you are tuning in for this live stream. My name is Tim Goldman, and I'm a review coordinator for Vectors and Illustrations here at Shutterstock. I've been with Shutterstock for about 2 years, since 2012. I'm actually a designer and illustrator myself, so I am super passionate about anything creative, especially when it comes to graphic design, vectors, and illustrations. And part of my role is helping to coordinate the review of all vectors and illustrations that are submitted to the site. So today's workshop is going to be all about preparing your files so that they are ready to go for our site and for our customers. We want to make sure that all of you, as you're submitting your images, whether it's for the first time or whether it's just the next time, that you're following all of our restrictions, all of our standards, and you're able to get your content through our system very quickly and get published and uploaded on the site in a quick way. So we'll be going through quite a few things. Be sure to take notes. We'll have a great, some Q&A at the end. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you. So let's get started. First of all, we'll just talk about how we define illustrations and vectors at Shutterstock. You might say, well, isn't a vector an illustration? Well, at Shutterstock, we kind of view these as two different content types, so we'll define that for you. Then we'll talk about just general preparation for either vectors or illustrations. So we'll go into just some general things that cover both content types. Then we'll drill down into each individual type of content. So we'll go into specific ways of preparing your illustrations. There's definitely specific things you have to do to prepare those illustrations. And then finally, I'm talking about preparing your vectors, which can be a little more complicated since we're dealing with a more complicated content type. So there are quite a few steps to take there. And then finally, we'll have some Q&A. So let's start off talking about illustrations versus vectors at Shutterstock. Like I said before, you might be thinking, isn't an illustration a vector? Is a vector an illustration? And in a way, a vector is always an illustration, but an illustration is never a vector at Shutterstock anyway. So let's talk about how these content types are defined. So illustrations at Shutterstock. Illustrations at Shutterstock are not vectors. They are pixel-based JPEG images. So these mainly can be any kind of pixel-based image as long as it's an illustration, not a photo. A lot of times, customers who aren't necessarily adept at vectors will wind up downloading rasterized illustrations because they don't have the knowledge or maybe even the software to be able to work with a vector. So the rasterized version of the vector will work much better for them. But they can really be many different types of contents, mediums, subject. So anything from paintings and drawings, any type of non-digital scanned artwork, 3D renderings. We get so many 3D renderings. These can be 3D interiors, which we now accept. If you see it on the blog, they can be 3D objects. They can be 3D icons, people. Really, you name it. We have a 3D version of it. And then finally, rasterized vectors, of course. You are able to submit the same design or illustration both as a rasterized vector or as a EPS vector. The one thing you definitely want to remember, whenever you're submitting illustrations in the content editor, you always want to make sure you check that off as an illustration. If you don't check that off, it's going to delay the time in which your images are reviewed. All right, so vectors at Shutterstock. So vectors are always editable EPS files. We only accept EPS files. We don't accept AI, we don't accept PDF, SVG, only EPS. Customers really love our vector collection, really mainly due to the versatility of vectors. As many of you are vector artists out there, you know about the adaptability of vectors. You can take an icon and use it on a business card, and then use it on a billboard, and have no loss of resolution at all. Our collection encompasses many uses and subjects for vectors. So some of the typical ones are icons, backgrounds, textures. Design templates are very popular. So brochure templates, website templates, infographics, of course, are wildly popular now. I'm sure you guys have all seen so many great infographics out there on the web, and our collection certainly has that covered. But you can see a lot, even more than that. I mean, maps. I could go on and on, basically. Whenever you submit vectors, you always need to also submit an accompanying JPEG preview image. And that way, our customers can actually see your vector on our site, since you can't display an EPS online. And now a new feature that some of you may or may not be aware of is that the JPEG preview is available as a downloadable image for our customers. So you want to be sure to upload at least a 4 megapixel size image to ensure that a customer is getting the largest quality size JPEG. All right, so let's move on to just a general checklist for preparing either vectors or illustrations. These kind of cover both content types, not necessarily the file type, but really more the subject of what you have in the actual images. So first of all, whether it's a vector illustration, you always want to make sure that they are free of trademarks. We are very sensitive to that. Next, you always want to manage your metadata. You want to make sure that your titles and descriptions are accurate, that they clearly define and describe your image. You also want your keywords to be applicable and not include any sort of trademark words. And then finally, did you use a reference image when you created your vector or your illustration? A reference image meaning, did you take a photograph and then did you trace it to create your silhouette, or did you auto-trace it to create some other aspect of your design? If so, you'll need to provide that for us when you submit. So let's dive into this a little bit further. So first of all, for trademark issues, there's a few things we look for in both illustrations and vectors. For vectors or illustrations, you need to remove any personal logos or signatures from your artwork. We can't accept any artwork that has a personal logo or a signature because essentially that is your trademark, that's your design, and our customers can't license your images if it contains those things. So let's look at a couple of examples here. Here we have our sort of Moneybags character. I think he kind of looks a little bit like Mr. Monopoly, kind of like the comic book version. And you can see in the sort of lower left corner here, very tiny, there is a signature of the artist. So unfortunately for this reason, that means that we wouldn't be able to accept this really nice illustration. So if the contributor does go into their image and they do remove the signature, now it's gone. Maybe easier to see over here. Now it's gone, so now this actually can be accepted. So it's as easy as that. It's just taking away that signature before you submit. Let's take a look at a personal logo. Actually happens to be my personal logo. This is one of my illustrations. I'm quite fond of robots, and I draw a lot of them. But so I have my own personal logo in here. It's my initials. So clearly, that's something that's my own copyright, my own trademark. So for this reason, I would not be able to get this accepted. But once I remove these logos, these icons that are not just for general use, they're actually identifying myself and they're identifying my brand, now they're gone, so this is okay to be accepted. All right, so next we want to make sure that you also don't include any sort of trademark logos, branding, or objects. We have a list of restrictions available on our blog, actually. If you go to the contributor tab, and you'll notice right away there's a list, there's a pop-up for restrictions right there. You can go through the entire list there to get a sense of what's okay and what's not okay. So let's look at a few examples that you might think are okay, but well, we'll see. So we have these three objects. What do they have in common? We have a Rubik's Cube, which is a really popular toy from the 80s. I had one of the original ones, so I remember it well. Then we have the Bluetooth icon, which you see that everywhere, every mobile device. And then we have an isolated illustration of the Empire State Building. So what do they have in common? These are all restricted from commercial use. So we cannot include any of these designs in our illustrations or vectors. So therefore, they would have to be rejected. So next, another popular thing, especially with people who are submitting for the first time, is submitting illustrations of celebrities or public figures. I know celebrities are super fun to draw. Everyone wants to do their version of Lady Gaga or whoever. I certainly have done a few of those myself. While they are super fun to draw, they're not something that we can accept. We do not accept illustrations or vectors of celebrities or public figures for commercial use. So yeah, these guys are fun to draw. I mean, we even have, we've got Spock, we have Madonna, and for those that don't know, Judge Judy. She's sort of an American icon. Hopefully you've seen her out there. But while they're fun to draw, these are all restricted for commercial use, so we wouldn't be able to accept these guys. And then finally, let's talk about metadata. Metadata is how we define our titles and keywords, and our titles and keywords, like titles, descriptions, and keywords. So you want to be sure that your titles and descriptions are always accurate and complete, that they actually are accurately and completely describing your design or your illustration. You can add up to 50 keywords, and I would definitely recommend adding as many keywords as you can. The more keywords you can add to your submissions, the greater chance your artwork will be found by customers. But you want to make sure not to include any brand names or any sort of trademark names, especially when it comes to social media, tech terms, things like that. We want to make sure to not use those terms. So let's look at some titles for some icons. We'll look at icons and some patterns. So we have some icons here, and in the first row, you can see the way they're titled is just vector flat icon. Well, that could really apply to probably millions of assets on our site. We have a lot of vector flat icons. So imagine your frustration, doing a search for this, and you're just coming up with thousands of results as a customer. You're not going to get to the specific of what it is you're trying to get out there. So by changing your title to be more specific, to talk about the style or the subject or something else about the design of your submission, you're going to get more people finding your work, and then hopefully resulting in more downloads. So the row below, we've changed the titles. We're now more specific. With the thumbs up icon, we're calling it thumbs up vector flat icon. The middle one is microphone vector flat icon. The last is question mark vector flat icon. Specifically talking about the actual subject of the icons. Let's look at a few patterns. So on the top, we have these sort of similar geometric, they are abstract backgrounds, it's true, they are abstract, but abstract background, again, could describe thousands and thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of images on our site. You want customers to find what it is that you are wanting to show. So a more applicable title, more descriptive title would be colorful abstract background with dots, rings, and bubbles. It's exactly what these are. And you can see it's not difficult. I mean, we're using all the same titles. They really accurately describe all three of them. So they're going to make sure that your designs are found by the people who need them. Let's talk about some keywords. So we have an example of this really cool fashion illustration. This is definitely a pretty contemporary style. These sort of girls with the big eyes, very, very popular right now. And we see some keywords on the right there, what the contributors submitted. You notice the ones that are bold. These are keywords that don't really fit, or they have some other issues. So words like girls, teens, shopping, pink, boxes, bows, ribbons, cute, sassy, those are fine. Those all, and the other ones, they all do describe the image. The ones in bold, boys, there's no boys in this image at all. Blue, orange, yellow, we're not utilizing these colors in this illustration. So these don't apply to the image. And then finally, H&M. I mean, H&M is a popular, store, and it involves fashion and shopping, but it's a trademark name. So we can't include that in our keywords. So this would not be acceptable. So once these are removed, now we see a good list of applicable keywords. Even including things like social and friends and young women. These are all very applicable to this image. So for this reason, these would be acceptable. And next, I think this is actually the last one of the general, we're talking about reference images. So did you use a reference image to create your illustration or your vector? Illustrations or vectors that are directly based on a photo or a sketch must have the original reference image attached to your submission. And just as a reminder, of course, your reference image must be something that you own the copyright for. So you have to take in the photo or draw on the sketch. It has to be something that you have created in order to create something else from it, create a derivative work. Yeah, you can't take something you find online and trace it. That's not going to be acceptable for us. And so finally, yes, you want to upload that reference image in the property release section of the content editor. And I'll show you what that looks like. So let's take a look at a vector here. It's a really cool little illustration of a cow in a meadow. Pretty simple kind of mod kind of graphic. But when I created this, I based it on a photo that I took. So here's the original photo that I took myself. And now I'm going to have to make sure I upload this in the content editor. And so that's what it looks like here. So what we want to do, is when you go to the content editor and you're at the section where you're editing your titles and your metadata, you'll notice you kind of can see it, but on the bottom it has a section to add releases. So you want to click add release, and then you want to make sure when you do add the release, you want to select property. That's very important. Make sure you select property. By default, it will come up as a selection for model, but if you do that, we can't accept it if it's submitted in the model release field. So you want to make sure to always select property. All right, so that's sort of the general, that applies to jet vectors and illustrations. So let's talk about just preparing your JPEG illustrations. So JPEG illustrations have to be at least 4 megapixels or higher than that. So that's the same as our photo collection, no different there. Illustrations need to be free of any sort of poor rasterization or any kind of artifacts, anything, we don't want to have our customers download one of your vector or your raster illustrations and then they see it at 100% and it doesn't look very good. So we want to make sure that they're crisp and clean at 100%. If you have scans or photos of non-digital artwork, you'll need to be sure to upload a property release along with that image. So it's a little different than the reference image. This is actually a property release that you'll need to have included. If you have portraits of any recognizable people, you also will need to have a model release. And so really that's, if the person can tell, that, hey, that's me in that painting, then you'll need to have a model release to go with that. And then finally, whenever you submit a rasterized vector as a JPEG, be sure not to include the term vector in the metadata. And I'll go into that in a little bit. So let's talk about first making sure your files are larger than 4 megapixels. So megapixels are not to be confused with megabytes. That's something that I know a lot of people I've worked with, they do get those mixed up. Megapixels are, the pixels are actually the colored dots that make up the image. Megabytes, of course, are the file size itself, the sort of RAM it takes up in your computer. So to determine the megapixel dimensions, you're just going to multiply the height by the width of the image. So for example, if I have a 4,000 pixel by 3,000 pixel illustration, that's going to equal 12,000 pixels, which means it's actually equivalent to 12 megapixels, totally sufficient for uploading to the site. All right, so whenever you also submit JPEG illustrations, you want to make sure that they are free of what we call artifacts, or sort of like remnants of indicating poor resolution, or poor rasterization. JPEG illustrations need to look crisp at 100%. So my big advice here is always make sure to view your illustrations at 100% before you submit them. That's how our reviewers are looking at them. So you want to make sure they look crisp and clean at 100%. You want to be mindful to especially check all areas of rasterized vectors. Whenever you rasterize vectors, sometimes if you're using certain effects or you're using certain types of techniques like gradients or blends, they might poorly rasterized in certain sections. So definitely look overall your entire image and make sure the entire thing is rasterized well. Don't ever scale up your JPEGs, because when you scale them up, you're going to lose resolution. Yeah, JPEGs can only be scaled down. They can never be scaled up. And whenever you're creating collages, make sure never to, again, it's sort of the same thing, never scale up. You can take elements at 100% at 300 dpi at least, or whatever the final resolution is you're working with. You can scale them down, but you don't want to be like scaling them up. These are not vectors. Pixels will break apart when you're scaling them and increasing them in size. So let's just look at an example, just an overall poorly rasterized vector. So we have this kind of cool, rasterized vector of this sushi, sort of Japanese meal. It's really, really cool. But when you look at it at 100%, you can see it's really breaking apart. It's really like, it's very, I hope you can see. It's very blurry, so it's not crisp. It's not a crisp and clean vector file, so therefore we wouldn't be able to accept this. And essentially just means just re-rasterizing your file at 300 dpi at a very large size so that it can be over the 4 megapixel requirement. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about property releases. So for non-digital artwork, as well as 3D interior renderings, you have to submit a property release. So all non-digital artwork will require a completed property release with a thumbnail of the artwork, of course, attached to the release. And then if you're submitting a 3D interior rendering, and this is just 3D interior renderings, you'll need to submit a 3D interior rendering release. And definitely check out the site for more details about that. But check out the blog, excuse me. We have a whole article about 3D interior renderings there. Yes, and then finally, you want to make sure that you don't include the term vector whenever you're submitting JPEG illustrations. JPEGs are not vectors. That's sort of lesson one from the beginning. So even if you are submitting a rasterized vector, we don't want you to include the term vector in the metadata at all, or even in the image itself. The reason being is that when customers are searching the site, if they use the term vector, they want to find vectors. So we don't want them going into JPEG illustration and they can't find your vector file. All right, so now let's go into checklist for preparing your EPS vector files. So as I mentioned, this is going to be a little more complicated since EPS vectors are a bit more technical. There's a bit more to them to prepare. So hopefully this will be helpful to everyone out there. Pardon me a moment, I just need to take a sip. I'm getting a little dry. All right, so similar to, sort of similar to JPEG illustrations, we do have a size requirement for vectors, but this isn't, this is a size, a max size, not a minimum size. So the maximum size for vectors is 15 megabytes. Your vectors must be 15 megabytes or smaller. Your EPS files always need to be compatible with Illustrator 8 or 10, and we'll go into more of that later. You want to make sure, like I mentioned earlier, that you submit a JPEG preview image with your EPS file. Again, you want to make sure it's high resolution. High resolution JPEG 50 megabytes or larger, 50 megapixels or larger. Make sure all your type is converted to outlines. You want to make sure that all vector elements will fit within the artboard. Don't use any vector effects such as inner glow. We'll talk a little bit more about why we don't allow that. You'll also want to make sure to remove tracing layers that contain sketches, or make sure that none of your vector elements are converting into bitmaps. We want to accept vectors that are completely 100% editable. So having those things in your vector files does not pass that. You want to make sure also to expand all of your pattern fills and make sure to unlock layers. We want to make sure everything is accessible and easy to use. And then finally, make sure your file is clear of hidden objects. So let's dig a little deeper into these topics. All right, so starting off with your vector files, they have to be at least, they have to be 15 megabytes or smaller, which I know can be a struggle, especially if you're using a lot of gradients or blends, effects, things like that. So you can check the size of your file in your Finder window. I think whether you're in a Mac or a PC, or at least on the Mac side, you can use a get info. I'm sure there's a PC equivalent to that as well, just doing sort of like a get information about a particular file. I do have some tips. If you do have an EPS file that is much larger, and part of the reason why an EPS file actually winds up being so much larger than, like, let's say, just an Adobe Illustrator file, is that the EPS file is actually saving the preview of your EPS. It's saving, and that's increasing the memory. So the larger your vector is, actually physically in the file, the larger your file size is going to be. So a way to fix that is to reduce the actual physical size of your vector in the file. By doing that, you're going to bring down the file size. Also, watch the number of gradients or blends or transparencies you use in your files. Those will definitely increase your file size for sure, just because they're more like kind of optical effects. So Illustrator is going to build in a lot more memory to have to be able to store those. So your EPS files also have to be compatible with Adobe Illustrator 8 or 10. This is an essential requirement for all EPS files on our site. And this really is because we want all of our customers to be able to download your file and use it no matter what type of software, vector editing software they're using. So whether it's Illustrator CS, or it's Illustrator Creative Cloud, or it's CorelDRAW, or it's Inkscape, we want to make sure that your files are always going to be opened by our customers. So yeah, so you want to definitely save as Illustrator 8 or 10. When you save as Adobe Illustrator 8, that's the most basic format. So there really isn't much you can add there. You can't use transparencies. By saving as Adobe Illustrator 10, it does allow for the inclusion of transparencies. And then also, if you're working in CorelDRAW or Inkscape, you need to save those files to be compatible. So you can see here, saving the files, doing a general save as is how you need to do it. So when we do the save as, you can see the dialog box. All I've done is gone through and I select as the version Illustrator 10 EPS, and then I just finish the whole save as process, and now I've done my save as. My file is now compatible. All right, so you want to submit the JPEG preview with your EPS vector. You want to make sure to upload your JPEG preview image alongside your EPS vector. It has to be done at the same time when you're uploading. You want to also make sure, as I mentioned before, that your JPEG preview file is at least 4 megapixels or larger. Since these are going to be available for download by customers, we want to make sure that they're a really nice size for customers to use. Both files should be named exactly the same, except for the file extension. So, for example, here I have listed in the slide vector icon. So the title of the image is vector icon. For the EPS, it's vector icon.eps, and for the JPEG illustration, it's vector icon.jpg. So that marries the two together. They'll be associated together. Great. And then you also want to make sure, whenever you're saving your JPEG preview file, that your file is matched. You want to make sure that there's no color shift between the JPEG and the EPS. Many times, as graphic designers, especially if you work in print, you're working in CMYK, and then you convert your image, your CMYK image, to a JPEG. And it's still CMYK, except JPEGs are meant to be viewed on screen in RGB. So you want to be sure, whenever you're converting your CMYK-based EPS file, you make sure to convert it to RGB as well in order to maintain the color integrity of your design. You also just want to make sure that you use the same kind of crop. So if you crop something or you've masked off a design in your EPS file, or it shows in your JPEG, you want to make sure the EPS file matches the same crop that you have in the JPEG preview. We don't want customers opening up your EPS and there should be a mask on it. They see the design in our interface, they download it, they're like, this is great, I can't wait to use it, and then they open up your EPS and they see this design that's gone all over the place. It should be masked off, and it's not. So we want to avoid that. And in general, you just want to make sure the EPS and the JPEG are the same file. We do frequently see, we get the JPEG preview, we open up the EPS file, and it's a completely different design altogether. So we want to make sure they match. Next, you want to be sure to convert all of your type to outlines. This is an essential step because customers are going to be downloading these files, and they're not going to have whatever font you are using in your file. It would probably be great for customers to be able to edit the text, but it's going to mess up your design integrity if you're using text that's defaulting to whatever font that they have to Myriad or whatever Illustrator is going to use. So for that reason, we want to make sure all type is outlined. In order to outline type, if you don't already know, it's really simple to do. You just in Adobe Illustrator, you're just going to go to the type in the menu bar and then select Create Outlines, and you're done. Another way to also double check to make sure there is no live fonts or type in your image is to check the document info window. It should say none in that document info window. This is something that all of our reviewers are looking at when they're looking for type. If they get, they open up your file and they get the legacy font is somewhere in here, they're looking and checking to see and make sure there is no live typography. Also, just another tip: if you happen to be, using dummy copy, especially for like templates, I would recommend putting those on a separate layer because that way it's easier for a customer to remove if they download your file. So just to give you an idea of what the document info window looks like, this is what it should look like in your file. It should say none. So there's no live fonts present in your EPS vector file. So next, you want to make sure that all of your vector elements are going to fit within the artboard. This is really to ensure that your vector will appear correctly when it's placed in other software. And also, it's just generally better file construction. It looks better when our customers are downloading your vector files. This becomes, I think, a bigger issue if you happen to be using Inkscape to create your vectors, because Inkscape does not retain the artboard information from Inkscape when you actually convert it into a Adobe Illustrator EPS file. So in order to be able to make sure that your vectors fit within that 8.5 by 11 area, just size your vectors down to no larger than 400 pixels on the longest side. And then that way, your vectors will always fit within the artboard. Next, don't use any vector effects. We can't accept vectors that have vector effects. And when I'm talking about vector effects, I'm talking about the more optical or sort of Photoshop-based vector effects, ones that cannot be edited as a vector themselves. So things like Gaussian blur, the inner-outer glow, or drop shadow. I know, in later versions of Illustrator, these are editable, but if someone's opening up your file in CorelDRAW or in CS2, they're not going to be able to edit those. And in fact, those areas may even convert into a bitmap state. Often when you save them down as Illustrator 8 or 10, that's when we see the resulting vectors that have been converted into a bitmap state, which we cannot accept. Next, make sure to check your files thoroughly for any tracing layers. And again, those converted bitmaps I was mentioning, you want to make sure that you remove those tracing layers. Like, those should be gone. So if you've done a sketch, and a lot of times the way I work is I do sketches first. I'll scan that into the computer, and then I will kind of base my vectors on that initial sketch. And it'll kind of be embellished, and I'll add so much to it as I'm working in the vector, but it's always in there until I'm done. And once I'm done with it, then I get it out of there. I do a save as, just to make sure I have my original build file. Do a save as to the sort of your final art file that does not include that tracing layer. You really, as far as watching the gradients, watching for converted bitmaps, you want to watch vectors with gradients and transparencies. So similar to the vector effects, gradients and transparencies sometimes will also convert into bitmap sections when you are saving that down. You might want to try doing a flattened transparency at high resolution to detect if you're going to have this issue. A lot of times that will show, okay, you've got a vector effect applied, or you've got a gradient that's going to convert into bitmap, and you need to do some other technique or use some other method to accomplish the design or look you're going for. And then another way to make sure and just double check that you don't have any placed layers or any bitmap effects or vectors that have converted into bitmap, you can check the links window and see if there's anything there. Again, this is exactly what our reviewers are looking at. They're looking to see if there are links in your file. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Here's the links window, and as you can see, it's nothing to look at. There's nothing there. So that means our vector is free and clear of any sort of tracing layers or any converted bitmaps. Next, we want to make sure to expand pattern fills. I know pattern fills are very popular, especially now with the ability to be able to create great repeats and patterns in Illustrator and CS6 and in Creative Cloud. And that's an awesome tool. But again, not all of our customers are using the latest version of Illustrator, and we want them to be able to edit and manipulate all the vectors in whatever you're submitting. So you want to make sure, if you're using a pattern fill, be sure to expand it so that all the vectors inside the fill are going to be selectable and then editable. You also want to make sure to unlock all your layers and sublayers. The worst thing we want to do is have a customer download your vector, they go to try to click on it, maybe they're a little new to Illustrator, they don't know the kind of way around it, and they're not able to select anything. That means something is locked, something is inaccessible in your file. It's just the best practice just to keep everything unlocked, keep everything easy to use and right there for the customer. All right, and finally, we want to make sure that your files are clear of any hidden or extra objects. And this is probably, I'm kind of ending with this one because this is one that gets by a lot of people. You wind up, as you're working in Illustrator, I know how, when I work in Illustrator, I wind up hiding certain things or locking certain things, and you might be working on a little section of a design, and maybe you want to kind of play with it and off to the side, or maybe you're just working with several vectors at the same time, and you've got multiple designs. You got things off the artboard. You got things that are hidden in a hidden layer, and we kind of forget to check for that before we save our EPS file. So make sure do a couple of things. Zooming way out so you can see the artboard and then all around the artboard to see if there's any extra objects laying in there. Also, try to do an unhide, which on the Mac is an Option Command +3. That's the key command. And that way it'll reveal any sort of hidden objects, anything that you might have forgotten about that's been hidden away. It definitely works. And that actually, maybe even if you have like a tracing layer and you're like, where the heck is this tracing layer? It could possibly be hidden. So those are just, I know it's a lot of information about vectors. There's always a lot to do with vectors. It's, hopefully it'll help all of you next time you submit vectors. And then I have some useful links on our blog, just a few things. One is about editorial illustrations. That's something that I hope to talk about in a future ShutterTalk, get more into editorial illustrations, but you can read about it on the blog. Also, for more information about property releases for non-digital artwork, and also for the 3D interior renderings, those are also in the blog at these links. And then finally, I think it'd be great if you hadn't seen the last Shutter Talk about protecting your content. I think it's really important, especially as illustrators and designers, to get more information about what is okay to submit, what is not okay to submit, and I think checking that out, if you didn't get to see it last time, would be a great information for all of you. So thanks guys so much, and I'm excited to see if you guys have any questions.
If you have added elements to a photo that are illustrations, should we mark the image as an illustration?
Whoa, so the question was, if you've added illustrated elements to a photo, should you checkmark it illustration or not? That's a great question. It's actually one that we sometimes struggle with because a lot of times we do get these sort of hybrids between photo and illustration. Our sort of rule of thumb is that if the main subject is a photo, then it should not be tagged as an illustration. So if it's just a photo with a few illustrated elements, maybe in the background, then it should not be tagged as an illustration. If the main subject is an illustration with like a photographic background, so maybe a 3D rendering of a house with the background being a photo of clouds, that should definitely be tagged as an illustration.
Bitmap into vectors?
Bitmap into vectors. So the question was bitmap into vector. So I'm not quite sure. If you could possibly whoever's asking that question, if they could define maybe what they mean. Maybe it's about converting the vector into a bitmap or rasterizing the vector.
We'll come back to it.
Yeah, we can come back to that.
Can you talk a bit more about 3D illustrations and property releases for 3DS illustrations?
3DS. Okay. So property releases are only required for 3D interior rendering. So a rendering of the interior of a room like this, let's say. If you're doing just a 3D rendering of a sand, I'm trying to think of like a sand pail and a little shovel, or a 3D rendering of a robot, we don't need a release for that. It's only for 3D interior renderings. And if you go to the blog, you can check out all the information there. And the property release is a little different for 3D interior renderings. All we require is your name, the name of the software that you're using, so like 3D Max or Maya, any of the popular 3D software generators out there, and then just the type of license that you have with the software. So it could be a standard license, it could be a commercial license, and that's really it. It's a little more simple actually than submitting a property release for a non-visual illustration.
Is it necessary to expand any gradient object before converting it into EPS?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would recommend not expanding gradients because it's going to just really increase your file size. Because if you can imagine, a gradient, if you expand it, it's going to be made up of probably hundreds of paths, and all those paths, all those fills and colors are just going to build your file size way up. I would recommend with blends in particular, maybe expanding those, and then even like compressing them together so they become one object, and that way you avoid having multiple objects. Especially with like a long shadow on icons, we notice a lot of times the blends are left unexpanded.
Can I use any font included in Illustrator?
As long as it's outlined, you can.
Repeat the question.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. The question was, can you use any font available in Illustrator? And yes, you can use any commercially available font in your designs, as long as they're incorporated into your design. We don't want you, taking Myriad default font in Illustrator and then just typing out the entire alphabet and submitting it as a typography set. We don't want that. That's an issue for us. But if you want to use it in just your layouts, in your designs, like let's say it's a poster template and you have this font you want to use, it's fine to use as long as you make sure to outline it before you submit it.
When will a more mature format be the standard?
When will I think by a more mature format, they mean maybe more like later formats of Adobe Illustrator. This is something that we're looking into. I can say that. Really the industry standard is saving EPS files as Adobe 8 or 10. We are actively, always getting feedback from our customers. And this is something, it's kind of one of my goals for this year is to get a better understanding and see if that's something that we can look at later down the road.
There are sites that sell posters with editable text and they specify the font used too. Is there any possibility that Shutterstock will allow to submit files with text typing capability? Okay,
this is a complicated one. The question was, there are some sites out there that sell posters that include live fonts, and they also include the font along with the design, which allows for text to be edited, text editable capability. And the question was, are we planning to add this sort of functionality to our vectors in the future? That's a great question. It's not something that I can really speak to at this point. I think that it's a great idea for sure. But right now, we don't have any plans to do that.
This isn't really a question, but if there's a contributor saying that they're using a gradient tool and mostly finding their designs are being rejected. Do you have anything to
so this is okay, so I have someone writing in saying they're using the gradient tool and they're finding that most of their designs are getting rejected. I'm wondering if are your gradients like converting into bitmaps? what might be happening, if you're using the gradient tool and in later versions of Illustrator and CS5, CS6, you can actually adjust the transparency within the gradient tool. That could cause bitmapping because it doesn't, that is not a functionality of version 10. Version 10 does allow for transparencies overall, but the transparency within the gradient is sort of a newer feature, and as far as I know, it can cause converting to bitmapping. So that's my guess is what your problem is. If you can maybe, if that's not it, you have another issue with using the gradient tool, maybe you can rephrase the question. Yeah.
You mentioned you can check the blog for details on 3D interior property releases.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a sample somewhere?
Yep, in the blog post, yeah, the question was, I mentioned that in the blog there is a post about accepting 3D interior examples, interior renderings, and right in the post itself there are examples.
Sample releases?
There's a sample, I think there's a sample release in there. I'll double check. Yeah, I'm not sure if that, I'm fairly certain there is one in there. And if not, we'll look into adding one because that would be an important thing to have.
And what is the license required in description of property in those?
What is the license required in description of property? So the license for the, I'm imagining the license for the 3D software is what they're talking about. So so why do we require it? I think basically this is coming from our compliance team, and we just want to make sure that you have some kind of license to use the software. It just ensures, that whatever you're creating for us is on software that you own, that you're not using any sort of existing pieces and parts that you didn't create yourself.
If I create authentic illustrations, should I attach sketches?
Oh, the question is, if I create authentic illustrations, should I attach sketches? I would say probably not necessary, really. You don't need to. If you're creating authentic illustrations, I'm thinking you're meaning traditional or non-digital illustrations. It's not really required. We really are looking more for reference images for our vector collection, for photos that are filtered to look like illustrations, like really when they're utilizing kind of finished photos or drawings to create their artwork. So we don't really need to see your preliminary sketches for non-digital. And essentially by submitting a property release with that, you're just ensuring that you are the one who created the original artwork.
What are your thoughts on traditional art scans like watercolors, charcoal drawings, etc.? Is it possible to make good earnings from them?
So the question was, what are my thoughts on traditional illustrations, such as watercolors or drawings, and is it possible to earn money, get downloads from that type of artwork? I definitely say, we see a lot of that kind of thing, especially when it comes to like a lot of backgrounds and textures. We see a lot of painting, watercolor, traditional techniques used to create those backgrounds. And I feel like, overall in illustration, the trend has really gotten more popular for hand-done artwork, and even a hybrid between the two. So I really think that there is a market for it out there. And with the diverse range of our customer base, we have such a huge, wide international customer base. We just never know what type of subject or style they're really going to be interested in. So I feel like there's always an opportunity, no matter what your medium is, to be able to earn income through Shutterstock.
Can I use all fonts that are available in Photoshop, similar to the earlier question?
Yes. So the similar questions we had earlier. Can I use all fonts available in Photoshop? And yes, again, as long as you're incorporating them into a design of some sort, you can utilize any fonts in Photoshop.
How many icons are the minimum to be included in one file?
Okay, the question was, how many icons are the minimum to be included in one file, or the max? Sorry.
Like, would one of the flat icons you showed earlier be enough to submit as its own file?
So the question was, like, what would be the minimum number of icons to submit in a file? Would a single icon, like I had showed in the examples earlier, be enough? Absolutely. You can submit a set of one. You can submit sets of course, more than one. I would for sure keep in mind that the smaller you make your icons, if you have a set of 30 icons, it's going to be harder for the customer to see them. And in a sense, by submitting them one by one, customer is going to be able to drill down exactly the icon they're looking for.
So a clarifying question. So a full property release is not necessary for a vector trace from a sketch. I've been submitting full property releases.
Okay. So this is a question to clarify property release and reference images. So the question was, a full property release is not required when submitting a reference image or a sketch used to create a vector illustration. And that's correct. A full property release is not required when you're submitting a reference image. You can simply submit just the reference image itself.
On my vector designs, I always put a keyword for vector and illustration. Is that okay?
The question was, on vector designs, I always use the keyword vector and illustration, and is that okay? Absolutely. Vectors are vectors, so we can use vector in the keywords and use illustration in the keyword. Kind of as I said before, vectors are illustrations, but illustrations are not vectors. So yeah, vectors and illustrations are fine to use in the keywords for vectors.
If I use an image that happens to be similar to the work of another author, will it be considered plagiarism? Many figures are known to all can be accidentally similar.
So the question was, if I submit an image that is similar to another artist, would that be considered plagiarism? And I think was saying that there's sometimes a coincidence that it might look similar to someone else's work. Well, essentially, that's a tough one. I mean, if we do, see something that, or we do actually get maybe even a complaint that, okay, your design, it looks very similar to a photograph or someone else's design. We'll look into it and we'll ask, if you were inspired, it's not unheard of for two artists to be inspired by the same thing and create very similar things. So, if we feel there's a need to dive deeper and get more information, then we will. If we feel strongly that you did use some other image to create your artwork that is something you don't own the copyright to, then that would be an issue, because that was something that would be a derivative work of someone else's copyright, which is not permissible for us. But we take it case by case, basically.
If I want to put some special text into a vector, for example, for a business card, how do I avoid creating outlines with fonts?
Okay, so the question was, if I want to put some special text into a business card, like business card template, how do I avoid outlining the fonts? Unfortunately, there really is no avoiding outlining the fonts. You always have to have the fonts outlined. And it'll be up to the customer to, basically look at that font, and if they can match it, they will, and if not, they're going to wind up using their own font anyway and removing what you have in there and replacing with their information. And I mean, specifically with things like business cards, you also want to make sure always to just use like generic names and phone numbers, information. Like it shouldn't be any kind of brand names or businesses. You want to make sure to keep all of that very generic and editable. But like as I mentioned before, at this time we don't offer vectors with editable flag type.
If I create a vector illustration directly in Adobe Illustrator using a graphics tablet and do not use Paper Sketch, how should I fill in the property release?
In that case, you don't need to fill in a property release. That's a digital illustration. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. The question was, I keep forgetting to mention the question. The question was, if I am creating a vector illustration in Adobe Illustrator and I'm using a graphics tablet, how do I fill out the property release? The answer is, you don't have to. You don't need to have a property release. If you're creating something using a graphics tablet, it's in Illustrator, you don't need a property release for that at all. I think it's also worth mentioning in the notes area that you've used a graphics tablet to create your artwork, because that just helps the reviewer get an idea of how you've created your work.
What do I need to give as a referral picture? I imagine maybe it means as a reference image.
So the question was, what do I need to give as a referral picture or what we call a reference image? Essentially, all you need to do is just give the actual reference image, whatever it is you use to create the silhouette, the texture, the auto trace, whatever it is. Just this JPEG, it can be a low-res JPEG of that image, and you're just uploading it in the concept editor.
And they need to own it.
And yeah, and you absolutely need to own the copyright. That's essential. You have to own the copyright over that reference image.
Can we put the font name that we use, I imagine, in keywords or in description?
Oh, yeah. The question was, can you put the font name used in the design? I suppose I don't see necessarily I mean, maybe. I mean, it does describe the font used in the actual artwork. So it's possible a customer might be looking for a particular font and a design to go with it. So at this point, I can't say. I think that's something I would actually have to check on to make sure. But at this point, I would say it's okay.
Is it possible to integrate a bitmap image into a vector file, a background JPEG, or TIFF with vector elements in front of that?
Whoa. Is it possible to? Sorry, could you say it?
Yeah. Is it possible to integrate a bitmap image into a vector file, a background JPEG, or TIFF with vector elements in front of that?
Is it possible to integrate a bitmap file with vector elements?
Bitmap image into a vector file.
A bitmap image into a vector file with a TIFF background, or
JPEG or TIFF.
JPEG or TIFF background
with vector elements in front.
Okay, so you're asking if you can incorporate bitmap elements and JPEG elements into a vector file, including vector elements. No, no. Those are what we would call links. They're uneditable as vectors. We want to make sure that vector files are free of any kind of bitmap or JPEG images. So there are ways you can convert those images using gradient meshes. You can convert them and turn them into an editable or supposedly editable a vector file, but essentially it would be a vector. It's no longer a pixel-based JPEG. We want to make sure that the vectors are all 100% editable by customers.
Can I upload the same images as the photo I used for creating the illustration? I imagine, can the photo be...
Submit the photo. So the question was, can I also submit the photo used to create the illustration? Certainly, you're welcome to submit our photos, and as long as they meet our photo requirements. I mean, we definitely, take a look on the submit site and look for what our requirements are for photography. Of course, our photo collection is reviewed with different standards than our illustration collection. So, you might do that. Your illustration might get accepted, your photo might not, or vice versa. So, but certainly, you're welcome to do that.
Is it admissible to submit vector in form of file that contains a combination of raster? Is that similar to what you were
similar
getting
to the
before?
other question,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so I think that is it for today.
Okay. All right. Well, I think, yeah, it sounds like that's wrapped up our Q&A session. So I just want to say thank you very much for tuning in today. I'm looking forward to doing some more of these throughout the year.
And the video will be up later today.
And yeah, of course, the video of this will be available later on today, so you can go back and watch again and pick up any of the points that I may have gone through that you want to go over again. Yeah, so this is great, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing if you're a new contributor. I'm looking forward to seeing your initial 10 images, and if you're an existing contributor, I'm looking forward to seeing more and more of your amazing and fantastic vectors and illustrations. So, thank you, everybody.